Hello everyone, we are coming in here for the video for this week. So this is our last before the Easter holiday, so hopefully everyone's having that come and go along well. So for this week, to kind of close out March, as I realize that next week it will be April, we're just going to go ahead here, just to pop in a video here before Easter, and we're going to go ahead and cover the 19th president, as we've not done. I think the last time it's been almost 2 months since we covered a president, and I want to keep this series moving along and hopefully finish it relatively at some point. So today we're going to cover the 19th president of the United States out of the presidential series, and that is this dude, President Rutherford B. Hayes, or Rutherford Burchard Hayes, if you want to include his middle name. But this is Mr. President Hayes. Now, Hayes is a president that, while he might not be very well remembered by the majority of people, to me, he is very memorable because he is his home and his gravesite are literally within an hour's drive of where I live. He grew up in about the same area that I live in currently, so he's a little bit, I wouldn't say that personal, but it's a president I definitely remember more than some of the others at times, like right off the bat, simply because he grew up around the same area that I'm living in. And he's not that far from me. I can go see his house and his presidential library and grave about any day I wanted to just take a trip over to Fremont if I really wanted to. But we'll get into that here a little bit later. So, President Rutherford B. Hayes was our 19th president of the United States. He was president for a single term from 1877 until 1881. And unlike certain modern circumstances, the election of President Hayes, as we shall see, could be one of the few instances in American history where one could actually argue there was some corruption in the election. I know that is a hot topic right now, considering the whole thing with 2020, and I have not seen a shred of evidence in my mind or in my personal view from what has been presented that supports any kind of massive fraud. So, in my personal belief, there is nothing to back it. There's nothing concrete that has been shown. I mean, there's been tons of claims, but I have yet been be presented with the solid evidence and data before my very eyes to actually prove that. So I don't consider the 2020 election to be in that book. Others do, and you're entitled to your own opinions. But in this election that Hayes got, it is probably what we could also call one of the most contested, if not probably the closest presidential election in history. Hayes got into office by a single electoral vote, and they didn't even determine the winner until a day before the scheduled inauguration, which we'll see why that happened here in a bit. So to start, as we always go with these videos, we go a little bit with a biography of the president, and that's how we kind of follow along. We'll get up to cover before they were president, we cover when they're president, and then we cover a little bit of the post-presidency of what we know happened after. So with Rutherford B. Hayes, he was born on October 4th of 1822 in Delaware, Ohio. He was an Ohio president. Ohio's also got the nickname of Mother of Presidents because only the state of Virginia has given the country even more. And his parents were Sophia Burchard Hayes and Rutherford Hayes Jr. Unfortunately for President Hayes, his father was not very, how should I put this, not a very healthy individual. He was a farmer, he was a local farmer in the area, and he had actually ended up dying before Hayes was even born. So Hayes never actually got to meet his father, because his father passed away shortly before his son's birth. President Hayes, or Rudd, as he was known to his family, was the nickname they gave him as he was growing up as a young boy, and his sister Fanny were raised by his mother and uncle, his mother, of course, Sophia, and then I believe it was her brother, Sardis. Sardis, I believe, was his mother's brother, not his father's. But Sardis Burchard was raised Rutherford B. Hayes and his sister Fanny, these two young children, after the death of their father. Sophia kind of lives with her brother and goes ahead and raises the children in what was then called Lower Sandusky, Ohio, which today is now known as Fremont. Why is it called Lower Sandusky? Well, for those of you who might be people that live in Ohio, you know there's an Upper Sandusky. But you might ask, why would Fremont be Lower Sandusky, even though it's more north than Upper Sandusky? Well, in terms of lower and upper, we're referring to how far inland the river is. So if we're going to Upper Sandusky, both Fremont and Upper Sandusky are along the Sandusky River that goes into Lake Erie, and Upper Sandusky is closer to the headwaters of the river than Fremont is, of course, because Fremont is actually close to Sandusky Bay, where the Sandusky River actually empties into Lake Erie. So Fremont got the distinction back in the day of being called Lower Sandusky, since it was near the lower end of the river, technically, where it would empty into the lake, and Upper Sandusky got the nickname of Upper Sandusky, where it still retains today. Eventually, Fremont was renamed after John C. Fremont, who was one of the famous explorers of California and also the first Republican presidential nominee back in the 1850s, but not at the time that Hayes was growing up there. His uncle Sardis was a local businessman, a very successful businessman at that, and he kind of acted as a father figure to the young Rutherford as he was growing up, so that he had a father figure in his life. Hayes received education at schools in Delaware and Norwalk, Ohio, and as well as Middletown, Connecticut. He eventually went out of state to also complete some education. He was a very well-educated man, as we will probably see here, because he ended up also graduating at the top of his class in 1842 from Kenyon College in Gambier, Ohio, and then proceeded to earn a law degree from Harvard University in 1845. So already by 1845, Hayes has attended multiple schools both in Ohio and out of state. He's attended and graduated top of his class at Kenyon College in Ohio, and now he's also got a law degree for practicing law from the most prestigious university in the United States, Harvard. So he's already done this literally by 1845. So by the time he is 22 years old, 20, 23 years old, he's already done this. And Hayes, after getting his law degree from Harvard, Hayes was admitted to the Ohio bar for practicing law, and he began a law practice at Lower Sandusky, now Fremont. That was where he began his law career. However, he soon moved to Cincinnati because he realized that the city was the fastest growing in the state and had a lot of opportunity for new and upcoming lawyer like him to really start their own law practice there. There was much more opportunity in a big city like that than there would be in Lower Sandusky, he thought. So in 1849, Hayes moved to Cincinnati and developed a successful law practice in the city. He opposed slavery and became very active in the newly formed Republican Party in the 1850s, which had been the political party that had been formed around by northern anti-slavery Whigs, as the Whig Party had split apart, and the anti-slavery faction of it eventually kind of coalesced and formed into the Republican Party because they were opposed to the extension of slavery in the territories. In 1852, Hayes ended up marrying Lucy Ware Webb. She had graduated, and Lucy Hayes was a very unique individual for her day. She did a lot of things that was not typical of a woman of her age, that was not actually seen as common, and it actually was quite a benefit to her. For example, when he had married Lucy, Lucy had already graduated from Westland Women's College in Cincinnati, and she was also going to be, later on, of course, because they weren't president and first lady yet, but later she would also be the first lady to graduate from college. So it was quite a substantial benefit for Lucy, because she lived in a world where women were very much expected to stay at home, be a good housewife, keep the home tidy in order, raise the children. They weren't expected to go out and get an education. And Lucy was very well educated, just as much as Rutherford was. And that really added a boon to her. She also had a very strict policy in the household of no alcohol. She was not an alcoholic drinker, and neither was Rutherford by extension when he married her. In fact, during the White House years, she also enforced that ban at White House dinners most often or not, and she kind of became known as Lemonade Lucy, not because she particularly liked lemonade, but because it was a non-alcoholic drink that was more widely available. The couple eventually had 8 children. 5 of them would survive into adulthood. In fact, when Hayes was elected president, they still had 2 of the young kids living with them, which I believe they had a daughter. Also, Hayes had named after his sister, Fanny. And then I cannot quite remember. I believe it was Scott. Scott was the younger boy that they had at the time that was also living them. So you had Fanny and Scott that were still kids when their parents went to the White House and got to live there with their parents. In 1858, the Cincinnati City Council ended up appointing Hayes to the position of city solicitor. So he was basically the top law official in Cincinnati by 1858. Because of his successful law practice there, he had come to the attention of the city council, and they appointed him to be the city solicitor. He was then reelected to that same post in 1859, a year later, which boosted his profile in Ohio, because now he is the top law officer in what is perhaps the fastest growing city in the state. So that is definitely going to raise your political profile a little bit. Shortly after the outbreak of the Civil War in 1861, Hayes would volunteer to join the military, so he is again another president. He's our second president so far after Ulysses S. Grant that served in the Civil War, and he volunteered to join the military as soon as the conflict broke out. He served in the 23rd Ohio Infantry Regiment as a major, and he ended up being seriously wounded at the Battle of South Mountain in Maryland. And during the war, Hayes was eventually promoted to brevet general, major general, by the end of the war in 1865. So by the end of the war, he had went from a major to basically a full-on general, is what he had become. So that was Hayes's military career. So he put the politics in his law career on hold during the Civil War. Lucy sometimes would get to come see him, but not often. And we do have a couple pictures here. I think. Let me see. I believe I have. Yes, I do. So this is a picture of Rutherford and Lucy on their wedding day back in 1852. This is a picture of them both. Notice Hayes does not have a beard, as he does here in his presidential portrait. He had a beard by that time. He did not have a beard then. That's him and Lucy. Lucy would not change much in complexion, I've noticed, over her years. Her facial features pretty much remain the same, despite some slight aging, but she was fairly constant, almost an ageless face as time went on, from what have seen. And here's a picture from 1861 at the outbreak of the Civil War of Hayes in his military uniform as a major in the Union Army upon joining the conflict. By that time, he had grown a beard. So while he was still in the military in 1864, because mind you, the Civil War lasts until 1865, the local Republican Party in Cincinnati had nominated Hayes for Congress while he was still in the military, because they recognized he was a very popular figure there, and he could definitely, possibly take a seat in the House. They wanted to get a House seat in the U.S. House of Representatives that included, the district included Cincinnati. Hayes was a very well-known figure, so the Republicans kind of tapped on his shoulder and say, hey, you want to run for Congress? We'll support you. We'll nominate you. And Hayes did accept the nomination. However, he refused to campaign at all because the war was still going on. He was still enlisted in the military. And to quote, and this was a quote from Hayes himself in a letter that he had wrote to his friend, the Secretary of State of Ohio, William Smith. Hayes had wrote this in a letter as to why he refused to campaign despite the fact that he was nominated. He wrote that, quote, an officer fit for duty who at this crisis would abandon his post to electioneer for a seat in Congress ought to be scalped. So in Hayes' opinion, I'll run, yes, but I am not going to quit my military duties that I have to this country in this middle of this grave crisis that is in, of where it is questioning whether or not it's even going to, be preserved. Hayes argued that I'm not going to drop my military duties just to campaign. I will run, yes, you put me on the ballot if you want, but I don't expect me to come back home and quit my military duty just because you want me to run for Congress. And the people must have generally agreed with Hayes on this predicament, because despite the fact that he did not campaign actively for his seat, he more or less just let his supporters at home do it, Hayes ended up actually getting elected to that seat in the U.S. House. So Hayes, however, would not take that seat officially until he left the Army in 1865 at the end of the war, and that was when he would take his seat in the U.S. House of Representatives that following in December of that year. So he would leave the Army probably about May or June after the war was pretty much over, and then by December he officially had joined the Congress to his elected seat that he had technically won the year before. Hayes was reelected to the House of Representatives in 1866, but he ended up resigning in 1867 to run for governor of Ohio. He also won that election and was reelected as governor in 1869. So he was also a governor of Ohio. And after the end of his second gubernatorial term, Hayes wished to retire from politics. He said, "I've had enough. I've been in law, I've been in the U.S. House of House of Representatives, and I've been in the Ohio governor's office. I don't want any more to do with politics." His party thought otherwise. So when 1872 came and Hayes indicated that he was perhaps wanting to step down from political life, the Republican Party, still seeing that he was a popular candidate in his home state, very much wasn't willing to let him go right off the bat. So in 1872, when the end of Hayes' second gubernatorial term came up, they nominated Hayes for Congress again that year, but he ended up losing that race. Hayes and his family would then proceed to move back to Fremont from Cincinnati, where he would then practice law for another 3 years. So 3 years would pass. Hayes would go back to Cincinnati, continue raising his family, continue living modestly, running his law practice again that he had established there. Not really getting too much involved with politics back in between 1872 and 1875. Between those 3 years, he really wasn't all that involved. In 1875, Hayes was elected governor a third time as the Ohio governor on a platform of securing black voting rights and an economic plan calling for a gold-backed currency, which was a hot debate back in the day as to whether or not the U.S. currency should be backed with gold or silver. Of course, silver activists were very active at this time because they're operating out in the American West, and the American West has a lot of silver mines. So these silver mine owners are wanting to get rich quick. So what better way to do that than to get the government to back the currency with silver, and thus there'll be a need for the U.S. government to be buying silver by the ton just to finance and back that money financially and to also mint it into silver coins, which at the time was another issue because the Congress had actually stopped the production of silver coins for so many years at that point, and you have your silver activists who are begging Congress to reinstate the mint to start resume the production of silver coinage, which will become an issue during Hayes' presidency. So that brings us to 1876 and the controversial election that was. At the Republican National Convention in 1876, the party was split over exactly who they should nominate for the upcoming presidential election. Ulysses S. Grant at this point has served 2 terms, and Grant had indicated that he was somewhat open to serving a third if he was nominated. He was not actively positioning himself for it, but had kind of indicated that he would be willing to go on for a third if the party so chose to nominate him again. Of course, by this point, Grant's administration has been plagued with all kinds of rumor and gossip about it being corrupt and full of crooks and cronies and can't be trusted. So there's a significant faction of the Republican electorate and the delegations that are not willing to even consider nominating Grant for a third term. Instead, their candidate was House Speaker James G. Blaine, the senator from not the senator, but the representative from Maine at the time. And Blaine would actually run in quite a few presidential elections, if I can recall correctly. But he is the other alternative, and there's quite a few Republicans who won't go for Blaine either because there's a similar allegations against him that he's also a crooked and corrupt politician, which, let's be truthful, most politicians are crooked and corrupt, even to this day. We're just being honest here. Most of them are. There's definitely one or two good ones that still do their balanced job, but it's few in between. So because of the split back at the Republican National Convention in 1876, because of the split that is occurring, it takes them a couple ballots before they can find a candidate who they can back behind. And on the 7th ballot, Hayes' name was entered as a compromise candidate, as someone that didn't seem to offend either of the two sides in the Republican Party and might just be able to get the nomination. And it worked. Hayes, on the 7th ballot, upon his name being introduced for the nomination for presidential candidate, actually won the vote, and he was nominated as the party's presidential candidate for the 1876 presidential election. He mostly had won this for his reputation for being an honest, loyal, and inclusive politician, and someone that honestly most people felt do a basic good job and be an honest man about it. In the 1876 election between Hayes and his Democratic opponent Samuel J. Tilden, who was the governor of New York, so you have the governor of Ohio going against the governor of New York. It's kind of odd. You got two governors going against each other. Tilden won the popular vote by over 250,000 votes. So Hayes did not win this election with the popular vote, and that is a very rare occurrence in American history, as there has only been a small handful of American presidents who have won election without winning the popular vote. The first was John Quincy Adams back in 1824. Then you had President Hayes. Then we also had, who else am I thinking of here? George W. Bush, I should say, not George H.W., George W. Bush in 2000. He did not win the popular vote, that very close 2000 election. And then the most recent president who did not win the popular vote on either of the two times that he ran was Donald Trump. Donald Trump did win the presidency back in 2016, but he did not win the popular vote. So that's actually quite rare that a president gets the presidency through the electoral vote, but does not win the popular. So that's only about a case of maybe 4 instances or so that has occurred. There could be another smashing in there somewhere, but I can't quite recall it at the moment. So Hayes, in this 1876 election, it's already obvious he's not exactly the people's choice. The people's choice was Tilden. However, the problem comes because Democratic and Republican parties in Florida, Louisiana, and South Carolina are having mixed results in determining who won their states, because each party it's so close in these 3 states that they can't determine an exact count, and each of the 2 parties is claiming that their candidate won it. However, this becomes vital because the other states have been determined. And it becomes clear that without those 3 states determined, neither Tilden nor Hayes has a majority of the electoral votes to be officially called as the new president-elect. So there's a problem. You've got to get these 3 states determined, or we don't know who's won this. And there were 2 results, of course, from each state, because each party's trying to clinch that state's electoral votes for their candidate. Congress would end up appointing a 15-member committee to determine the winner of each state's electoral votes. However, since the Republicans were in the majority in Congress at the time, the committee was also held by a Republican majority. There were Democrats on the committee, but it was mostly Republicans since Republicans were in control of Congress. And, of course, the Republican committee chose to award all of the disputed electoral votes to Hayes. Upon hearing that the Republican committee would do this, the Democrats in the South, in particular, threatened secession and civil war once again, roughly only 12 years after it had just ended. So this is presenting a crisis, and Tilden is already siding with the Southern Democrats and signifying he may not recognize what the Congress says if they do not do this fairly. This would ultimately be resolved with a deal that we often call the Compromise of 1877. It is also going to be significant to the post-Civil War South. In return for Southern Democrats backing Hayes and allowing the electoral votes of these 3 states to be put to Hayes, in return for them backing that and coming to acceptance of that, the Republicans would agree to recall all remaining federal troops in the South upon Hayes taking office that were enforcing Reconstruction still since the Civil War. Mind you, it's been 11 years in 1876 since the Civil War ended, and there's still federal troops in the South having to protect African Americans who were formerly slaves because there is racial prejudice and racial violence against them, and ensuring that they have proper rights. And the agreement with Republicans is, we'll go ahead and withdraw that because they know at this point the Democrats have managed to seize control of most of the state legislatures in the southern states. The Republicans really don't have any power down there anymore because of voter suppression of the African Americans down there. So they kind of realize that, and they make this agreement with the Democrats. If you back our candidate with these electoral votes, we'll go ahead and we'll draw the last of the federal troops, and we'll end Reconstruction. We'll let you guys finally be on your own again, in charge of every one of your own affairs on your own ballot. Of course, the Southerners kind of jumped on this deal, also with the condition that at least one Southerner would be in Hayes's cabinet, that they would be also included in the presidential cabinet, which they also agreed to. Hayes was declared the winner by a single electoral vote on March 2nd, 1877. Hayes got 185 and Tilden got 184. It was that close. Nowhere in U.S. presidential election history has a president ever won political office by a single electoral vote. It's never been that close. Hayes would end up taking a private oath of office on March 4th, with a public inauguration taking place on the 5th. Northern Democrats, who had not agreed to the Compromise of 1877, unlike their Southern counterparts, declared that Hayes had stolen the election, much like certain people nowadays, and then referred to Hayes as, during his presidency at least, instead of calling the president Your Excellency, they referred to Hayes as Your Fraudulency, saying that he was a corrupt, that he had stolen this election from Tilden and it was not right, even though it had been pretty much a political deal that had done it. But that still doesn't make it quite right, because that means there definitely was some political maneuvering in there. So it is one of those few elections that you could legitimately argue there was some corruption and fraud going on at some level. Whether or not Hayes really had any direct involvement, I don't think is true. I think it was more congressional Republicans that had more anything to do with it. But Hayes was just kind of the unfortunate result of this, and he got all the blame, even though he may not have been as directly involved with the committee and everything else. But that was one of the few and only instances that you could legitimately claim that could have possibly been a factor in the election, not like the one 4 years ago that everyone is like wanting to go over these things. Because as of yet, as I've said, I have yet to see anything concrete that would significantly say that this past election was a massive fraud. I'm not saying there couldn't have been a little bit of fraud. There's probably a little fraud in every election. But on the level that they're claiming, there's nothing yet that has been presented data-wise to fully support what they're saying. So I don't consider that one. So now we come to Hayes's presidency. He is now President of the United States as of March 4th, 1877, and upon entering office, Hayes kept his word from the Compromise of 1877 and agreed to immediately end Reconstruction in the South by withdrawing all the federal troops that remained there. By doing so, Hayes also made it so that the Southern states, without the presence of federal troops to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments, the Southern states wasted no time passing what we call Jim Crow laws, which were the laws that started segregating the blacks from the whites and started putting the whites-only areas and for colored people only, that whole business that would continue until the 1960s, roughly almost 90 to 100 years later. The moment the federal government turned its back on African Americans in the South, the Southern people wasted no time making more than clear what their racial prejudices still were, despite the fact that they could not get over they had just lost a war, and in some cases still can't today. And they decided that as soon as the federal troops were gone, okay, now we can enforce our racial hierarchy and have no consequences. And what the sad thing is, they were right. Because the federal government at this point was tired of trying to babysit the South, and there were legitimate arguments from the Republican side that we're tired of acting as the babysitters and the enforcers. The South is going to do what it's going to do. Just let them do it. And that was unfortunately a bad thing, because that led to another 90 years before there was even some semblance of equality in the American South with African Americans. And it was in the North too, because in the North there was also some segregation laws that were also passed. But in terms of the South, it was almost immediate. As soon as Reconstruction ended, they wasted no time passing these Jim Crow laws and making sure that African Americans were kept in pretty much a second-class citizen position. So the administration of Hayes, in coordination with this withdrawing of the federal troops and ending of Reconstruction, also recognized that the South still needed to be, in large part, physically reconstructed, if its infrastructure had been massively destroyed during the Civil War. And so they actually put aside quite a bit of federal funding to actually help the southern cities in the South actually rebuild themselves, which has kind of become stagnant in literal reconstruction since the end of the war. It hadn't occurred as it should have. Hayes would also appoint Southerners to influential, high-level government posts during his presidency, and his actions would appease the Southern Democrats, but at the same time antagonize certain Republicans who still had quite some quiet qualms about the Southern Democrats, and about the Southerners in the South, who had just only 12 years before, had tried to secede from the Union and fought a 4-year-long bloody war. Hayes, during his presidency, did pursue a very noble cause, in my opinion. He pursued civil service reform, which was becoming quite needed at this point, which angered, actually, the faction of Republicans that were opposed to him since the convention. Now, what Hayes wanted to fix was up until the early 1880s, between Andrew Jackson and the early 1880s. So we're talking about late 1820s, early 1830s, about 50 years. It was common practice that for important government posts or jobs, there would be a line of office seekers every day out the president's office, out the White House doors of these people waiting to go see the president. And they didn't have to have any specific qualification. All they had to do was, like, can I have this job? Can I have this job? Can I have this job? And if the president liked you, sure, you can have this job, even if you were in no way qualified to do that job. You could be postmaster, you could be land surveyor, you could be a whole bunch of things. And this had started with Andrew Jackson. It was very commonplace during the 50 years that if you had been a political supporter of the president during their election campaigns, that it was called the patronage system, that if you supported them during their campaigns and during their presidencies, it was expected that if you went to the office asking the president for a certain government job or something like that, the president would give you it because of loyalty, that you had shown loyalty to them, that you had supported them, and most people would do this in expectation that after the election, if their candidate got into office, they could go to the White House and say, "Oh, I supported you, so can you give me a job?" And this would happen in most cases. But at the same time, it led to a lot of corruption because you have people in it just for the money. And also at the same time, you have a lot of people in certain jobs that aren't in any way qualified to do these jobs. And Hayes was one of the first presidents to really start recognizing that this was becoming an issue. Grant had also tried to touch upon it, but he had been largely unsuccessful. So Hayes, he ends up wanting to pursue civil service reform, but because this has served the political establishment so well in Washington, D.C., there's a good, significant faction of Republicans that have always been opposed to him. They're even more opposed to him now because of this, because they benefited from this patronage system, and they did not like that Hayes wanted to end the patronage system altogether and appoint civil servants based on merit and skill. He ended up actually fighting with New York Senator Roscoe Conkling in a fight over removing 2 bureaucrats from the New York Customs House in New York City. And one of those 2 bureaucrats who ended up getting kicked out by President Hayes was a man known as Chester A. Arthur. And the reason that we kind of mention him is, as we're going to see here in a couple more videos, Chester Arthur, about 1881. So right at the end of Hayes' term, a couple months after he leaves office because Garfield's assassinated, Arthur becomes Garfield's vice president, and then upon Garfield's assassination, Arthur is now president of the United States. So it's kind of weird that Hayes ended up kicking out this bureaucrat, Chester Arthur, out of the New York Customs House, and then he kicks him out, and then a couple years down the line, this guy is also president, and this was even the odder thing, as we'll discuss when we get to him. Arthur is literally the president that passed the Civil Service Reform Act that officially ended the patronage system, despite the fact that he had been a major benefiter of it. Why? Because it also became a major problem as to why Garfield got assassinated. And we'll discuss that when we get to Garfield, which would be our next president. Because Garfield was assassinated by a guy that felt he was being denied a job by the president, even though the guy was also a loony nutcase. But the gist of his argument was he did not like that he was being ignored and thought he should have been given a government job. And Garfield got assassinated over that, and then Arthur would later, ironically, be the very president that would finally accomplish civil service reform and end the patronage system. So it's kind of odd. And we have a political cartoon, I think, that was drawn at the time of that event of Hayes making sure that Garfield was one of these 2 representatives that was kicked out. But before we do that, I'll show this one as well. This is the electoral map from 1876. So as you can see, very close election. Hayes got all the red. The gray are still territories at the time. All the blue are Democrats. And then these 3 southern states, South Carolina, Florida, and Louisiana, these are the 3 that were so hotly contested, and these were the 3 that decided the election. By those being awarded to Hayes, it got him the presidency by a single electoral vote. And here is that political cartoon. And this one, I think, might have also been drawn maybe by the time that Garfield maybe wasn't president, but maybe he was vice president, because it says another president who had a rise in the world. So I'm guessing this is after Arthur became president. But here we have Hayes kicking him out of the New York's Customs House. There's Arthur. And if you look up the road where he's going to be going, it's Washington. So it's kind of odd that just a couple years later, he would also be in the same position as Hayes. Excuse me. So after this whole debate, due to the economic downturns that occurred in the United States after the Civil War, the Western and Southern states wanted to strengthen the American dollar. And this came along the debate of whether to back it with a gold currency, with a gold standard, or to back it with silver and a silver standard. And this was eventually proposed by the silver advocates by the Bland-Allison Act of 1878 was introduced into Congress, which would allow the resumption of the minting of silver coins after they had been stopped for 5 years. So the United States Mint had actually stopped minting silver coins 5 years before 1878, so back in 1872. And now there's a bill in Congress to resume this production of silver coins, which would greatly serve the silver interests of the silver mines out in the American West. Hayes has always been a proponent of the gold standard, and he was not really very much for this silver standard coin currency system. So he was concerned about inflation that could occur from it, and the backing a gold standard for the U.S. currency, of course, was his primary concern. So Hayes and others opposed the act. Hayes actually vetoed the Bland-Allison Act when it came to his desk. Unfortunately for Hayes, Congress overrode his veto, and the Bland-Allison Act was officially passed and went into effect in 1878. With the passage of the Bland-Allison Act, a new silver dollar was then made, one of probably the most famous coins in American history, the Morgan silver dollar, which, in case you do not know what a Morgan silver dollar looks like, I don't know how well that's going to come in. This is the Morgan silver dollar. This is an 1883 Morgan silver dollar. So these were the coins that went into production. In fact, the very first one of these they have at the Hayes Presidential Library in Fremont, because the very first one that the Mint ever made was actually given to President Hayes as a gift, despite the fact that he had not supported the bill and actually tried to veto it. And this is what the back of one looks like, in case anyone wants to know. It's actually a very beautiful coin. And today they're one of the most highly collected coins out of American coins. That's 1883, and I have one more here. This one is 1885. It's a little more dirty, and it's got a scratch on it. That's an 1885 one. And this one, I believe, was made in Philadelphia. The other one was New Orleans. But these are what was made by the result of the Bland-Allison Act, was these guys, Morgan silver dollars. Hayes would end up during his presidency having one episode that might also be questionable, and he himself later wrote in his post-presidential years that he did question his actions in response to this, and that was the railroad strike of 1877. It had begun as a strike on the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad out in West Virginia and Maryland, particularly I believe in Martinsburg, West Virginia, is where it really had kicked off. I want to say it was West Virginia, or it could have been Maryland. I think there's a Martinsburg in each, but I think it was the one in West Virginia. And it started there, and initially it was just railroad workers more or less refusing to work because they wanted a little bit of a pay raise and some other added benefits and stuff like that and unemployment. And on the Baltimore, Ohio, it never really got violent, but in Philadelphia it did. On the Pennsylvania Railroad, they actually the mob formed in Philadelphia and actually burned a train depot, which we do have a depiction of here. This was something that occurred on the pages of Harper's Weekly. So here's the mob burning that depot building in Philadelphia. And in response to this, Hayes, who, mind you, we're entering the Gilded Age of American history, where the big business corporations, like such as those of the railroad and the steel industry and the oil industry, are really starting to dominate the U.S. economy, and they're really starting to dictate politics as well. Hayes does what is perhaps questionable on his response to the strike. Yes, people were angry, and yes, they should not have burned, and that was definitely something that should never have happened. But Hayes ended up siding with the big business. He ended up siding with the railroads, and he sent in federal troops into Philadelphia. And if I have read correctly, the troops actually ended up opening fire on the mob and killing quite a few people. And that was the part I think that's questionable. Now, whether or not Hayes was the one that gave permission for those troops to use deadly force, I don't know. I don't know if that has been fully defined or if it was more the command of the local commander. But Hayes, in his later post-presidential years, did later question whether or not he had done the right thing in sending federal troops to break up a uh, strike, break up the railroad strike by common laborers. He did later question in his post-presidency years whether or not that had been the right decision to do. In the manner of which it was done, I don't think it was right, but should it have been done in Philadelphia, despite since the mob was turning violent? Probably, but in other areas it should not have been done. But that was perhaps one instance where it probably wasn't the best thing that he had on his presidency was, the association with the breakup of that strike in 1877. So Hayes would decline to run for re-election in 1880, arguing that it would only cause another significant contest like in 1876. So in 1880, he says, I'm not going to run for re-election. I'm just going to serve the rest of my term, and then I'm out. So he ended up retiring from politics after leaving office on March 4th of 1881. So then we come to his post-presidency years. After leaving office, Hayes and Lucy would return to their estate at Spiegel Grove in Fremont. That was their personal estate that they had established there in Fremont, Ohio. He devoted himself to educational issues, such as prison. He also devoted himself to humanitarian issues, such as prison reform. And Hayes would serve as a trustee to 3 universities during his post-presidency years: Ohio Wesleyan University, Western Reserve University, and Ohio State University. Yes, Buckeyes. In 1882, he was elected first president of the board for the John F. Slater Education Fund for Freedmen, which was a $1 million endowment to provide Christian education to Southern blacks. And among the people who was a recipient of that fund was Webb Du Bois, the famous African-American humanitarian himself and activist himself as well. In 1883, Hayes became first president of the new National Prison Reform Association, and over the next decade, he ended up traveling the country speaking on policy reform despite his advancing age. Lucy ended up passing away in 1889, which left Hayes heartbroken at her loss. He had lived with her for so many years, and they were very, very close for a presidential couple. Hayes later remarked after her death that he didn't know how he would go on without her. And in January of 1893, while he was on business in Cleveland, Hayes ended up falling ill. He sent for his son, Webb C. Hayes, to escort him back home to Fremont, and upon getting back home, Hayes ended up passing away of heart failure on January 17th of 1893 at the age of 70. After his death, Webb established a presidential library at the Hayes' estate at Spiegel Grove in Fremont, which set a precedent for the establishment and creation of presidential libraries for post-mortem presidents. So establishing a presidential library for a president after they had died instead of planning it while they were still alive, such as the case with like Barack Obama and Jimmy Carter's. Most of the modern presidents, we planned them while the president was still living. They may be passed now, but it was already planned. But then we have ones like Abraham Lincoln and Hayes, where it was very much after they had passed on that these libraries were established. And Hayes was the first of the post-mortem ones to actually get a library. The newest presidential library, to my knowledge, that has been completed is the Warren G. Harding one down in Marion. Beforehand, they just had the home of President Warren G. Harding, who was president from 21 to 23 till he died in office. He was the last one to come from Ohio so far, and they just recently, I think like 2021 is when they opened it officially. They had created a whole new presidential library museum for that, in addition to running the home right next to it. So now that is, and as of right now, that is the newest presidential library. I believe the one for Barack Obama is supposed to open up within a couple years, but it could be a little bit yet. And I don't know how far along Donald Trump's is coming along. So here we have an image of the home in Fremont that you can go see. I've actually been to it myself a couple times, and you can. They offer tours through the home. It's right next to the library, the Presidential Library Museum building. It's right next to it. This is a picture of the home. It's It's got a lot of trees in it. There, and one of the oddest things is there's so many squirrels, and the squirrels will come right up to you. They're not afraid of people. They see people every day, and these squirrels will just like stare at you. They're not like normal squirrel that would skitter. They just see so many people, because you can also just go walking through the grounds of Spiegel Grove and not have to pay for anything. It's also public access to just go walking through there. If you want to go into the museum or actually go into the house, you have to pay, of course, for that. But if you wanted to go see the grave in the back or just walk through the grounds, it's a very beautiful and peaceful setting to just take a walk through because it's very shaded. And in the back of the house is where President Hayes is actually buried. And this is actually a photo I took back in June of 2020. So this is him and Lucy's grave back behind the house. So that is a photo I actually took about 4 years ago now of where their grave is. Their son Webb is also buried back there with them as well. So I think that wraps up this week's video. Oh, and then even today, Hayes is only remembered very slightly, I think, by most Americans. And for example, this is right here one of our presidential dollar coins that we had out about 10 years ago. This is a proof, of course, but they were also general circulation ones of these. And on this one, right here is President Hayes. So that, I think, concludes our video for this week, our last for March and our last before the Easter holiday. So if anyone should have any questions or anything to add, feel free to put that in the comments section and I'll be more than sure to go through it. As for next week, don't know what we're hitting yet, but we'll hit it when it comes time. So hopefully everyone has a good Easter holiday and a good weekend, and we'll all see you back. We'll see you all back here next week, hopefully, for the next video when it comes out. So until then, may everyone have a happy and blessed Easter and have a good holiday weekend overall.